Thank you for having me as a speaker. I'm just so excited to talk about this topic, as is my colleague, Michael Avedon. So let me share my screen and we will dive right in. So we're going to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is leading multi-site perioperative pragmatic trials. So this is the talk I wish somebody had given me when I was starting off. So we're going to talk about kind of what we know now, what we wish we knew then. Michael and I have divided up some of these topics, and we're going to talk for about 40 to 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. So I have no financial disclosures. I'm not going to reference anything off-label or investigational drug use. My grant support is from these organizations, both in the past and currently. And not surprising, it takes a lot of money to do these kinds of trials. So you do need grant support. So our objectives for the talk are to understand if and when a multi-site design will or won't help you. We want to also give you some tips for picking partners, designing your study, what should be your governance plan, as well as some of the nitty-gritty IRB, designing your trial, when to use a pragmatic trial, financial structuring, and then we're going to talk about kind of a time capsule for each of us, what we know now and wish we knew then. Let's dive in. So I also want to start with a case study, because this can give you an idea for kind of the trials that we do. So at least for me, all of my research work is in advanced care planning and palliative care, specifically in critically ill and perioperative populations. I'm a critical care anesthesiologist and palliative care physician and researcher. And I don't think I need to tell you perhaps, but especially when I started this work in about 2008, 2009, it was absolutely the Wild West. There was pretty much no research in advanced care planning, much less palliative care in perioperative populations. So to give you an idea for the kind of work to build up to a large pragmatic trial, this is essentially my career funding that built up to our current trial. So I had a FAIR award from 2011 to 2013 that gave us foundational research that allowed me to submit for a single site trial, which was 2012 to 2017, which is funded by PCORI. That was essentially for a video-based advanced care planning tool, single site. The data from that then allowed us to submit, again to PCORI, to be able to fund a multi-site pragmatic trial. So this is the timeline for me, and it's not a rare timeline. These trials take years to build up. So absolutely do it. I encourage you to, but also kind of go in with your eyes open and know that this is a marathon, not a sprint, and that you build this over years. For me, this has been almost, well, over a decade, about a decade and a half. So this was our single site trial, which is in and of itself a lot of work. And so you're doing a single site trial, and we had a lot of publications from that. And it took this body of work to be able to submit to be successfully funded for a large pragmatic trial. So just getting expectations out there. So our current pragmatic trial is to compare surgeon alone versus surgeon palliative care team co-management for patients preparing for upper GI cancers. We're powered on patient-reported quality of life at 3 months post-op. This is actually the first multi-site RCT that's ever integrated specialist palliative care into the perioperative space. So there are 5 sites. And it's a $2.15 million contract. It's probably going to be even a little bit more. We were initially, I started submitting this a version of this in 2014, 2015. It was funded in 2017. I lost track. It was my 3rd or 4th time around with PCORI, and I'd submitted it to probably 3 or 4 other funders as well. And so we started funding in 2018, and we are due to be finished March 2023 with our funding. So yet again, perseverance is important for work like this. You often are not funded on the first time, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th time. So our 5 sites are Stanford, Johns Hopkins, the Dana-Farber, University of New Mexico, and the Ohio State University. So this trial is ongoing. As I record this now, we have 366 participants on our way to our goal of 380. So we are almost done. So that's an example. That's the large pragmatic trial that I'm running right now. I want to talk now generally about large pragmatic trials. And when you're thinking about it, what do you want to do? So this is kind of back to basics, but you really want to have this level of understanding as you're walking in. So first off, you're doing an RCT. What level are you going to randomize on? Are you going to randomize on the patient level, on the provider level, like cluster randomized by provider, or on the hospital or the site level, cluster randomized by site? What you do depends on your intervention. And it can depend on not just the intervention itself, but the state of the intervention at your own institution. So just to give an example, so we are studying specialist palliative care. When we first submitted this to our funder, we submitted it randomizing patients at the patient level. So a patient's either randomized to surgeon alone or surgeon palliative care team co-management. And one, the funder came back and said, actually, we want you to cluster randomize. And they said, we want you to cluster randomize either by surgeon or by site. So cluster randomizing by site, usually you need upwards of 12 clusters to have a trial that makes sense. So suddenly we're a much, much, much bigger trial, a 12-site RCT. We went back to the funder and the funder said, no, we don't think we want you to be that big. They said, how about surgeons though? We want you to cluster randomize by surgeons. We specifically are working in patients pursuing curative intent surgeries for upper GI cancers. So our prototypical patient has pancreatic adenocarcinoma and they're going for like a Whipple or a distal pancreatectomy, splenectomy. And when we looked, we did point out and said, you know, there's not a lot of surgeons who do these surgeries at each site. So each site might have only 1 or 2 or maybe 3 surgeons that do enough of these surgeries that we could cluster randomize. And the funder still said, hey, you know, we're concerned, but we actually then came and presented data. So these are data from one of our sites where we said, hey, these are our patients who would qualify for our study. These were patients pursuing surgery for pancreatic cancers. And we looked and we said, there is no penetration of our intervention in this population. So as you can see here, this was 107 patients who could have been enrolled in our trial. And they looked and actually tried to see who had palliative care, specialist palliative care consults. And out of the 107, only 1 patient. And that was when they'd been in the SICU for 2 months afterwards. So we actually used these data to go back to our funder to say there is no penetration of our intervention in this population when we are starting. One of our exclusion criteria actually is you can't have seen specialist palliative care beforehand. And we were able then to talk with our funder and to say participant level randomization is actually appropriate. So I hope this discussion helps you to understand that this level of randomization, it's not a given. You have to think about your intervention, your site, and your timeline. And you know, we sure could have done a cluster randomized trial by site with 20 sites to cluster randomize, but that would be a huge trial, and it was much more than we could have gotten funding for. So you have to find a middle road. And then also too, you really want to think about, is your trial explanatory or pragmatic? I'm really talking about pragmatic trials today, but there's still a lot of kind of misunderstanding between. So I just want to spend a moment on this. So explanatory is really an efficacy trial. Does X work? I am giving drug X. Does it have an effect on QRS? It's really looking at a cause and effect. You want a very rigid study design. You want to minimize all of the potential confounders that could get in the way of trying to figure out whether drug X works. You have very, very selective study inclusion. And it's very different than usual care. It is on a study and the outcomes are very relevant for research. That's opposed to pragmatic trials, which are effectiveness. Does this work in the real world? Should we be doing this? How does this interact with actual delivery of care? So broad inclusion criteria, really looking at effectiveness and how something works in actual practice. You want to maximize generalizability. So you want something that's very nimble. And the outcomes are really important, not for relevance to research, but does this work in real life? And if you're trying to figure out, hey, is my trial explanatory or pragmatic, this PRECIS 2 can be really helpful. If you give across these different axes that you can see on the rays here in the circle, you give your trial a score from 0 to 5. 5 means it's very pragmatic, and 0 means it's not. It's probably very explanatory. So like even just looking at eligibility, who is selected to participate in the trial? We have pretty darn loose eligibility criteria. We only have 3 essentially. So we're probably a 4. But a lot of, say, drug trials for a chemotherapeutic for a cancer population have very, very strict eligibility among histology and type of cancer and person and age and coexisting illnesses and such. So they may be 0. And you can actually do your trial like this. And I definitely have had colleagues who have used this to present their trial to funders on presentations to say how much of an explanatory versus a pragmatic trial. So you could see A is a very strong pragmatic trial, B is a very strong explanatory trial, and C and D are kind of in the middle. So this is just helpful for you to know about your trial, and so that you can explain it to funders and that you can have an awareness of it yourself. Now you got to choose your comparators, and you really do want to think very hard about this, particularly in pragmatic trials. So you want your comparators to be real life things. You want to be able to define them pretty clearly and such. I work in palliative care, so I work in complex behavioral interventions. I'm going to leave this alone a little bit. I think Michael Avedon's going to touch upon it a bit as well, but you just need to be very, very thoughtful about this and to define it pretty well. Outcomes, outcomes, outcomes. You live and die by your outcomes. That's why there's 2 exclamation points after it. You really need to think about this. They must be measurable. And if you can, validated outcomes are highly preferred. You can have an outcome that sounds like it should make sense and it should be measurable and it should be great for you. But has it been measured before? Are there outcomes that actually are validated that can show responsivity and discrimination? That's really important. And I'm going to show you an example. And if possible, you really want to look at the outcomes in your target population that you are going to be studying in your trial. You can do that through a pilot trial or from using a previous trial, and I'm going to show you because that's what I did, that used these outcomes in a similar patient population. So let's think about this a little bit because this is really important. So this is an example of a poor outcome. I do a lot of work in ICU-based palliative care. I did a systematic review on this topic, actually I've done 2, where we looked at different outcomes that people used. And one of the most common outcomes for a palliative care intervention in an ICU was people looking at family satisfaction. Is the family more satisfied with care or not? That makes a lot of sense. Good content validity. If you look at the different outcomes out there, like family satisfaction in the ICU or critical care family needs index, you look at the items and you're like, oh, this makes sense. This looks like a good outcome. But let's look at the data. So when you look at family satisfaction here, so these are, we had 21 different trials in the systematic review, 14 measured family satisfaction, but look at that. Only 1 showed any signal in it. It's a great outcome when you think about it, but the practicality of it is there's poor discrimination, there's poor responsivity in that outcome. So please just use this and anchor on this. Just because something sounds like it's a good outcome, it may not be a good outcome. You need to make sure that your outcome measure has responsivity and discrimination, because if it doesn't, it's of no use to you in a pragmatic trial. So what did we do? We used a previous trial. We used the outcomes from this Temel et al. Trial that was looking at specialist palliative care in medical oncologic patients. And we really took those outcomes and moved them into surgical oncologic patients. And we used some of the outcomes in our pilot trial. So we not only had the outcomes that had shown responsivity in this previous RCT, but we also had shown responsivity in our pilot trial. So outcomes are really important. So now you also want to think about IRB. So first off, now you may not need to think about it anymore, because if you're doing a multi-site trial and it's NIH funded and it's after 2018, now you need to use a single IRB. This is data from, or this is from the webpage of the NIH. If you're not NIH funded, if you're doing something else, then maybe you could use multi-site or multiple IRBs. We started our RCT in 2017 when we started with the IRBs. So early 2018. So we are PCORI funded, not NIH. So we actually are multiple IRBs, but there's pros and cons to each. Do know it can take months to get through the IRB with a pragmatic trial. One of our sites, it took 14 months to get through the IRB. So just be ready, think about it beforehand. If your trial involves cancer patients, I do a lot of work in cancer, you often will have 2 IRBs. You will have a cancer center IRB and then your main IRB, and they don't work in parallel, they work in series. So that can take a while too. Do know that a lot of IRBs, they are built for explanatory efficacy studies. They are built for studies of that cancer chemotherapeutic. You are not what they're built for when you're doing a pragmatic trial, particularly like in a perioperative space. Like that is not what they are used to seeing. So, be patient, be ready to educate them, go in with a big smile. You need to partner with them. They are an ally for you, but they're not used to seeing you. And this is definitely what it feels like. Welcome to heaven, enter here. Your trial's been funded. Yay. Oh, well, crap. Like they're not used to your trial and you now have to spend a lot of time educating your IRB and sometimes even your own institution about your trial. Consent. It can be written, verbal, there can be a waiver. What is acceptable can vary between institutions. So with the multi-site trial, just be very cognizant of that. And you may have slightly different consent approaches for different sites. You want to check with the regulatory groups at your institution as well as at every institution that you're working with. If you are the coordinating center, be very clear about what are the regulations at your site, at the coordinating center. If your site is not the coordinating center, then get to know that coordinating center. There's one site that's a coordinating center, and you very much are following all their regulations and practices. So just make sure that you know them. Okay, you can have a data safety monitoring plan, a data safety monitoring board. If I had given this talk 3 years ago, I wish somebody had given it to me, I would have said one thing. What you do depends on the risk of your intervention being studied. If it's very low risk, you can have either. If there's any risk at all, you could have your DSMB. Your funder may have regulations. Your institution may have regulations. A plan is something that you've written and saying, I'm following this. A board is a group of people that you have appointed who are going to watch your trial, and typically once or twice during your trial, look at data in an unblinded fashion to give you input. If you have a board, be very thoughtful in selecting your participants. You want them to know the type of work that you do. You get to choose them. So choose people who can be independent and give you good thoughts, but who understand your work. I work in palliative care in perioperative spaces. A lot of people misunderstand that. I'm a big advocate of having patient and family member advocates, partners on boards. They provide a really valuable insight. We could have a whole separate talk on that, but do consider involving them. If I could have given this talk to myself a few years ago, I work with very low risk interventions. I have a DSMP plan. I would have chosen now a DSMB board because I have a plan. We have a lot stronger regulatory oversight from some of the institutions that do not understand palliative care, do not understand pragmatic trials. And we have spent days and days, hundreds of emails explaining to them who we are and what we do. If I had had a board, I think I could have averted a lot of that. So look, you can learn from my scars. I wish I had done a board for my current trial, but you live and learn. So make sure your trial has a governance structure. This is actually important when you are getting your funding. So you want to consider the different members of your team and how are they organized? If there's a conflict, who's in charge? How are things structured? So this is the governance structure for our clinical trial. There's an executive committee. You can see I'm ahead of that. And this is when we only had 4 sites, and we have a whole structure at each site. That's a lead PI, a lead palliative care clinician, a lead surgeon, and a lead patient and family advocate. So just think about the governance structure. It's important for your funding, and it's important for the functioning of your trial. So you can see the executive committee, and then there's all the sites. Other possible advisory groups for you as you're leading these trials, you can have a steering committee, you can have stakeholder advisory boards. We have a professional advisory board with different professional organizations, such as the ASA, the American College of Surgeons, the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, the Palliative Care Research Cooperative, the patient advocacy group, the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship. So you can have a publications committee or group authorship guidelines, particularly if you're going to be writing a lot. It's good to define this beforehand so that there's nobody's toes that get stepped on. We already talked about a data and safety monitoring board as well. Okay, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on finances and legal. This is important. It is your business. Nobody knows your trial as much as you. And particularly if you have a trial that's gone on multiple years, like mine has, I am the only institutional memory for this trial. And you need to remember this. Your legal people may turn over multiple times. You are the only real source of project history often. To me, at least, this is the least able to be delegated task, keeping track of the finances. I have colleagues who have a wonderful finance manager that they've had that hasn't changed, and they don't have to think about that a lot. I am envious. That sounds wonderful. I've never had that. I've always had to do I don't do the finances, but I have to have an awareness and to keep track of them. So you really want to look at your subcontract invoices. You want to verify the numbers are correct, because once you send that money away, you can't bring it back. And sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So you may have negotiated a certain price amount with your site PI at that site, and somehow it got miscommunicated to their legal office, and their legal office invoices you for a different dollar amount. I can't even count how many times this has happened to me. It's not malicious. It's just, it's large, there's a lot going on, and things get lost in communication. So read every invoice. They're not hard. I typically get a couple invoices a month. It takes maybe about 30 seconds each, but you do want to keep track of it. direct and indirects. So remember, directs are what you can budget. That's the part of the budget that you own the money for. If you get a $1.5 million award, you can budget 1.5 million. But if you get a 1.5 million award, your institution will get that 1.5 million plus a certain amount of indirects. So usually it's like 30 or 40% depending on the funder. So the institution may get 2.15 million. And of that, you have 1.5 million that you can budget. The extra, that 0.75 million, is the indirects that the institution takes for offices and lighting and such like that. But it can get very nuanced when you have a multi-site trial and subcontracts. Subcontracts get indirects too. Some of their indirects come out of your indirects, and some of their indirects come out of your direct, out of the money you budget. So they may get a certain amount of indirect, but it's coming actually from your direct as the site, main site budget. It differs by funders. It differs by the dollar amounts. Mine change after the first, I forget, like $30,000 or something. You need to read the fine print and work with your funders, because this can be thousands of dollars and it can absolutely throw you off budget. Data use, so remember that. Data use agreements, this allow for data and PHI to pass between institutions. They're absolutely essential for multi-site trials. Just know they can take a while to arrange, and complex DUAs can complicate your regulatory reporting. We have one site that has a DUA that's really different than the others, and it's been problematic for multiple years, and we just know it. So just be aware of that. Funding. So you can have block funding where a site gets a certain amount each month, and that's what they get regardless of what happens. Or you can have milestone-based budgets where they get a certain amount based on completion of tasks. Like our trial, we enroll per enrollee. If a site gets an enrollee, they get 1,500 directs, which comes out to 2,100 with directs and indirects. That 2,100 comes out of my direct fund, but that's what they get. Or a task, like if you finish your IRB, you get a certain amount of money. Speaking from personal experience, I've done both. As a recipient, I like block funding because I know how much I'm getting. But as somebody who runs the trial, I very much like milestone-based budgeting, because it allows me to actually attach my budget to deliverables and outcomes, and it allows me to stay within budget. So I strongly recommend milestone-based budgeting. Okay, finishing up, closing home. What I wish I knew then. Look at me, here's me over a decade ago. I look so innocent and happy. Little did I know how much fun and yet stress and goodness was coming as I became a leader of pragmatic trials. So what I know now and wish I knew then: trust, but verify, even with friends, and you can be working with people you absolutely love. And I encourage you very, very strongly. These trials are huge. They're in a large amount of time. Don't do them with people you don't like. Do them with people you like, because you're going to interact with them again and again and again and again. And you want to go on this journey with somebody who's fun. So absolutely collaborate with people you enjoy. And even if they're people you enjoy and they're your friends, verify. Monthly enrollment audits, twice yearly missing data audits. People can have the best of intentions, but sometimes things don't just work out. As the person who's running it, know what's there and what's going on, and just have that awareness. I already talked to you about directs and indirects. Read the fine print for what goes where for money. Know that you're going to do everything right, and there's still going to be problems. Just accept it. Scaffold everything you can. Automate a lot of your trial design. So have there be weekly site project manager meeting agendas, minutes, updates. Just try to scaffold everything so that you don't have to think about it. It's just the way the system runs. So we have standing weekly meetings, standing weekly minutes. We have monthly audit things that just happen. And I've worked it out with my project manager, and it's great and it's important. Also, as you talk with your project manager, just accept if you're running a large pragmatic trial, you're always going to have some sort of regulatory documents due. You're always going to be under some sort of audit as soon as one ends, another starts. These aren't audits because you're doing something bad. These are audits just because you're running a large trial. They can be audits from your funder. They can be audits from your institution. They can be audits from one of the sub-site institutions. So just accept it. It's part of the ballgame. Keep experienced people close. We have multiple people on the trial who are kind of my 40,000 foot experienced person call. I really am close to some of them, and I'll phone a friend. I'll call them if I have any questions. You can't do this stuff alone. It's very complex. Have people around you who can help if you can. And know that if for your funder, the program officers can be really helpful allies. We have been so blessed. We have had wonderful program officers from PCORI the whole way through who have really helped us with a lot of our problem solving. And I'm so grateful for them. And then last thing, know that running these multi-site trials is hard. Being a child of the 90s, there's going to be Barbie days. If you remember the Teen Talk Barbie from the early 1990s, she said things like, math is hard, let's go shopping. And we definitely have days on our study where we're going, research is hard. We don't go shopping. We like to go out to eat, but of course, in a COVID land, instead we're going out for a long socially distanced walk, but just accept it. This is hard. There will be days that you feel demoralized. That's why it's important to go on the journey with friends and just embrace it. So the unexpected, expected challenges, you will have sites that are poor performers, and they can be wonderful people with the best of intentions, but accept it, it's going to happen. You will have staff turnover. It's very painful. Just be aware of it. I already talked about regulatory and compliance. There's going to be hurdles. There's going to be hiccups. And there's going to be times even when your experts don't know what to do. I've definitely called one or two of my key 40,000 foot, done this all. Nobody knows more about these trials in the world than these people who looked and said, oh, I've never seen that. Oh, okay, let's figure it out. So there will be unexpected things, but it is really fun. And it's a privilege to do these kinds of trials. It's really contributing meaningful data for the world. And I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about them. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and we're going to have a Q&A afterwards as well. So thank you very much for spending a little bit of time with me today.